Trading card games have changed a lot in my lifetime, and I've played a lot of them. Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, Vanguard, Hearthstone, Chaotic, Duel Masters, One Piece, hell, even Kaijudo. If I had the opportunity to spend money on cardboard, or even digital cardboard, I've probably taken it. And the interesting thing is that almost every major change in TCG design over the past 30 years traces back to the same three underlying questions. How do you make a game where players feel like they have agency and control over their resources? Where winning feels satisfying and earned, and where the cards can allow players to express themselves in deck building. For me, the game that I think did this best in recent history was Legends of Runeterra. I absolutely loved the deck building and creativity that game allowed for, and it was extremely interactive and fun, and I got to use characters from League of Legends, which was a big hit for me, because I'm a degenerate. Unfortunately though, that game no longer has PvP, but Riot just came out with their new TCG called Riftbound, and that has pretty much been all I've been doing since it was released. This game is genuinely fantastic, and it takes on a lot of the best parts of the TCGs that came before it, so I wanted to take some time to talk about how Riftbound learned from other games to solve those big three questions. And in particular, we're going to be looking at how Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Vanguard, Hearthstone, Runeterra, and of course Riftbound all approach these issues, and how they've changed over time. And yes, Vanguard might seem a bit out of place here, but I think it's a good example of the kind of midpoint between the classic TCGs and the modern ones, as well as being one of the major pivoting points that TCGs began to work towards point systems rather than life systems. Before we begin though, if you enjoy the content here, consider leaving a like to show me that you want more videos like this. If you like these kind of video essay topics, I really enjoy making them, so that'd be cool. I also do Riftbound deck building challenges like this one here, and generally informative content like my deep dives into the cards. So subscribe if that's something you're interested in, support me over on Patreon if you want to go a little bit further, and of course you can join the Discord where we talk about all things Riftbound. But with the YouTube stuff out of the way, let's get into the video, which involves us going back in time a bit. The first question that all TCGs need to answer is, how do players actually play the cards? Because the resource system that a game uses determines the pace of the game, how much control players feel that they have, and how frustrating things can be when they go wrong. Starting with the granddaddy of all TCGs, Magic the Gathering, which has been around since 1993. Magic is a game where players begin with 20 life and need to lower their opponents to 0 life in order to win. And to do this, they can use several different card types, including creatures, artifacts, and enchantments that will stay on the field, and instants and sorceries, which are one-off effects that can turn the tide of the game. Most iconic to Magic, though, is the mana system. Each card has a mana cost, which players can pay for by tapping lands and generating mana. This is often the make or break factor in whether people love or hate playing Magic. And a big friction point for this is that these lands are part of your main deck. In the majority of cases, if your deck is built in a well-balanced way, this isn't too bad. And with the addition of new land types over time, like shock lands, MDFCs, and fetch lands for example, this is less of a problem than it ever was in the past. Ideally, you're able to draw into a few lands and get a couple playable cards, but the inherent problem with land cards is the high and low roll potential. Every so often, you will play a game where you almost entirely draw just lands, which is referred to as being flooded. Or you might see next to no lands and be mana screwed. You could build your deck perfectly, and sometimes the game just says, no, you're not gonna play this time. And that feels terrible. So much so that a defining part of just about every TCG that followed in Magic's footsteps would almost always be the question of how they can address the mana problem. How do we include resources in the game without creating a situation where variance can outweigh player agency? And it is a problem. In most cases, cards are balanced by the requirement to play them. Typically, the game should function that weaker and smaller cards can be played in the early game, and then players can ramp into massive, splashy, game-winning cards that are super satisfying to play. And if we look at Pokemon, which was released only a few years later, they actually have a really novel method for paying for their cards, as well as how the game is actually played. Rather than having a life total like in Magic, Pokemon revolves around collecting prize cards by knocking out your opponent's Pokemon. Once you've picked up all 6, you win the game. While Magic's only real dials to turn for balancing their cards are their mana costs, their power, and their toughness, Pokemon introduces 2 other factors that they can play with. Firstly is stages. Any Pokemon can be played at any time from the hand freely, so if you want to play a Kangaskhan, cool, put her on the board. But particularly powerful cards often need to evolve. So if you want to play a Charizard, first you have to play a Charmander, then on the following turn you can evolve it into a Charmeleon, and then finally the next turn you can evolve it into a Charizard. This kind of keeps that pace control that giving a card high mana value does in Magic. Though again, this has a bit of an inherent problem, as sometimes you might only draw Charizards, and you can't play them if you can't find those early stages. So how does Pokemon resolve this problem? Well, that's through supporter cards. There is simply no game that lets you draw as many cards as Pokemon does. I mean, there probably is, but let me be dramatic for a minute. In Magic, you might have a 3-mana spell that lets you draw 2 cards, and that's fine. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pot of Greed lets you draw 2 cards, and that's so powerful that it had to be banned for decades. But Pokemon says, hey, you want to draw cards? Sure. Here, discard your hand and draw 7. Or draw 4 cards. Or draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. These powerful cards let you fix bricked hands and really help the game feel fluid. Now, you can only play one supporter in a turn, but still they are very powerful and effective at solving this problem. The other dial that Pokemon added was swapping out land cards for energy. Rather than paying for cards up front, in Pokemon you can attach one energy card to them per turn, and that can be used to permanently meet the requirements to use that Pokemon's attacks. And of course, there were also support and trainer cards that could move these energies, search for them, or bring them back from the trash. Yes, you could be flooded or brick again, but the supporter cards really help solve this problem. And that is the big key to Pokemon's resource system. Sure, the game naturally has a ton of variance in it. What gets selected to be your prize cards, finding the right stage of your Pokemon at the right time, and drawing enough energy to actually use your cards. However, rather than removing variance, Pokemon does what's called smoothing. They know that the randomness is there, so they give you as many tools as possible to fight back against it so it won't be an issue. Even so, the idea of managing these resources can be a bit of a turnoff for a lot of people. And that brings us to 1999 with Yu-Gi-Oh!, which, similar to Magic, would require you to bring your opponent down to 0 life points to win. Though you do start at 8,000 in this game rather than 20, but the numbers are pretty inflated, so whatever. This is a game where the developers gave players essentially free reign, kind of. While Pokemon focused on giving players more tools to overcome variance, Yu-Gi-Oh! Instead gives the players as much agency as possible by not putting hard limits on just about anything, with the exception of the timing and play rules of its cards. You'll often hear people say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have a resource system, and that is kind of true, but it's a bit more complex than that. Yu-Gi-Oh!'s cards are split into 3 types, and each have their own dynamics. Spell cards are essentially magic sorceries, and can be played with no cost, though only on your own turn. Traps need to be set face down for a turn before being played, but could be used any time after that. And creatures have 2 rules. Firstly, you can only normal summon a creature once per turn, though any special effects that can summon creatures don't have a cap. And second, depending on the monster's level, marked by the Dragon Balls in the top corner, some of them would require you to sacrifice or tribute another monster that would already be on the field. Anything up to level 4 was free, 5 and 6 needed 1 sacrifice, and 7 and up need 2. In the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh!, this was all fine for the most part, though as the game has sped up over the years, this, quote, free resource system can sometimes make the game feel extremely overwhelming. Somewhere around the 10-minute mark of watching your opponent perform their combo can be a bit of a deterrent for a lot of players. Because of this, card draw is often at a severe premium in Yu-Gi-Oh! As I mentioned, Pot of Greed drawing 2 cards is broken, though that kind of effect is totally reasonable in Magic and negligible in Pokemon. Again, in those games they would have a cost associated to them, and that's a big difference though. Because when there's no cost and you have a draw engine, you can keep drawing into more things that you can play for free, which let you draw into more things, and then you've drawn your whole deck and boom, there's Exodia. Secondly, as playing more cards became more available, the board size kind of became a limiting factor as well. In Magic, players could have any number of cards on their field, literally infinite in some cases. And then Pokemon limited things to having 1 active and 5 bench Pokemon. Though in that game, you're often not having that many Pokemon in your deck anyways, so exceeding this 6 Pokemon limit is rarely an issue. And Yu-Gi-Oh! Pressed even further, letting you have 5 monsters and 5 spell and traps on the field. So while you could do more, the number of active game pieces is often much lower in Yu-Gi-Oh! And thirdly, as the game developed, another resource would become the focal point, and that is the extra deck. This is basically a toolbox of 15 cards that players could summon by meeting different requirements. For example, by sacrificing 2 monsters, they could summon the Link 2 Nightmare Phoenix. And this can also kind of be reined in by requiring specific archetypal sacrifices, attributes, or monster types, or by locking you into specific conditions for the rest of the turn. But as more summoning mechanics and options were added to this, players were essentially able to do cold fusion in Yu-Gi-Oh! If they really wanted to, even despite that. The monsters that you play suddenly became the currency that paid for bigger cards on a much larger scale, as tributing became synchros, synchros became Xyz, Xyz became pendulum, and pendulum became links. Each seemed like a natural evolution of what came before, maybe without pendulums being included, but with all of these extra options, the game became a lot more complex. So while Yu-Gi-Oh! System was fairly simple at the beginning, power and complexity creep really became a problem for a lot of people. And the cards being free in tandem with all of this meant that mental bandwidth kind of became the only resource that you need to worry about. So much so that, in some cases, players need to memorize spreadsheets to play their deck optimally. And this can be super fun and rewarding to pull off, but being on the other side of the table can make you feel like you are watching someone play solitaire. So, those are the 3 resource systems from the classic TCGs of the 90s that every game that followed has tried to learn or evolve from. Magic's lands that create mana, Pokemon's energy and evolution, and Yu-Gi-Oh's here as well, I guess. An interesting note, though, is how these resource systems have developed in their games over time. For the most part, Magic and Pokemon are largely the same. Yes, the cards are on a different power level now, and yes, there are some more consistency tools like the special types of lands I mentioned earlier, but the flow and pace of the game is still fairly similar, and the gameplay would be recognizable to someone who played in the 90s for the most part. They might be confused as to why SpongeBob SquarePants is on the field, but that's a different issue. Yu-Gi-Oh! Though is an entirely different game. Some people even jokingly call it Yu-Gi-Oh! 2. What used to be a pretty slow and grindy game where players edge each other out by building advantages through powerful spells and traps is typically finished in 1 to 3 turns after insane combo lines that just weren't even conceptually possible at the start of Yu-Gi-Oh! That isn't to say that either path is better or worse, but at least here it seems like by unlimiting resources, games might have a tendency to accelerate and adapt much faster than they would otherwise. But with that, let's hop forward to the 2010s with Cardfight Vanguard in 2011. Winning this game functioned sort of like the reverse to Pokemon's prize cards. In Pokemon, knocking out your opponent would let you pick up a prize card, and once you had 6 you would win, which is great, but it makes a bit of a win-more situation, where the player who is ahead is being rewarded and furthers the gap between them. To resolve this, Vanguard flipped that system on its head. Whenever your Vanguard takes damage, you would flip over the top card of your deck and place it in the damage zone, and once you had taken 6 damage, you would lose. However, some cards have trigger icons, which would give you benefits when you took that damage. This could strengthen your units, draw cards, and sometimes even heal damage. This meant that rather than widening the gap by picking up a prize card, you would always have a chance to mitigate the gap by hitting a trigger, which never led to any salty moments at all. Shout out to RNG and game design. This game is extremely different from the classics, though it does borrow quite a bit from Pokemon, in that it takes some time to actually be allowed to build up towards your bigger creatures, and that your main unit, the Vanguard, evolves in a sense. However, after turn 3, it tended to work more like Yu-Gi-Oh! In that there was no real restrictions, really. The first major resource that Vanguard has is your Vanguard's grade. Basically, the unit at the center of your board dictates the cards that you are allowed to play. They start at grade 0, and each turn you can ride them up to the next grade, which would allow you to play units of that grade or lower to the rest of your field. This was supplemented by giving each grade their own unique ability. Grade 3s had Twin Drive, which we'll talk about in a moment. Grade 2s could intercept attacks to block other units while on the board, and grade 0 and 1 could be used to boost the unit in front of them by adding to their strength. Speaking of which, the board is also a bit more constrictive in Vanguard, and in ways serves as another resource that you need to manage. Vanguard's field consists of 3 columns and 2 rows for a total of 6 spaces. Only units in the front row can attack, while grade 1s and 0s in the back row could support the units in front of them. Units could also move forward or back within their column, but could not move to other columns. And the Vanguard couldn't move at all. This meant that you needed to think ahead and plan out your board, because once they were on the field, you're kind of stuck with them in that column. In Vanguard, you can also protect your units by guarding with cards from hand. Depending on their grades, each card could add strength to the unit that was being targeted. Grade 3s added nothing, grade 2s added 5,000, grade 1s added 10,000, and 0s could add anywhere from 5 to 20,000. This meant that you also need to manage the amount of cards that you put on the field, or you might risk not having anything to protect yourself. Vanguard's most unique and defining resource, though, is the trigger effect system. Each deck had 16 grade 0s that had trigger icons on them, and when your Vanguard attacked, you would reveal the top card of your deck, or 2 if you are on a grade 3, that's Twin Drive. And if the revealed card had a trigger, you could assign a power boost to a unit on the board and get a secondary effect like dealing an extra damage, drawing a card, or healing damage. And so keeping track of these cards and your odds became important in navigating your decision making. It's kind of strange in that it's a resource that you don't manage directly, but that you need to keep track of. You don't really control whether or not you've drawn 10 of your 16 triggers, but you need to be aware that there are only 6 left in the deck. It is the single most casino-style TCG I've ever played, and depending on what your trigger checks were, you could sometimes just win or lose the game on the spot. But that brings us to the final resource in Vanguard that we're going to talk about here, which is your damage. And this, to me, is the most interesting part of the game. As I mentioned, if your Vanguard gets hit, you take damage, and taking 6 means that you lose. But many powerful abilities in the game have a counterblast effect. This meant that you would need to flip cards in your damage zone face down in order to pay for their costs. And some effects like Limit Break would require you to be at 4 or more damage to be active at all. So the more damage that you allowed yourself to take, the more abilities that you had access to in the game. But this also inherently meant that you were closer to losing. While the RNG aspect of Vanguard is a super love it or hate it system, I genuinely think that the damage system here is a massive upgrade to the prize card system in Pokemon in most cases. Outside of that though, Vanguard doesn't really work with much in terms of resources. If you aren't playing a deck that relies on counterblasts, then the costs don't really exist. If you're playing Limit Break, once you're at 4, it is always active. And so it kind of becomes Yu-Gi-Oh at that point, to the point that it eventually also got an extra deck that worked like a toolbox. However, Vanguard didn't really do anything to mitigate things spinning out of control and power creeping, and so things got so bad that they had to hard reboot the game. That said, their players had already become accustomed to a higher level of playing the game, and so the second time around they had to start at a higher point to keep them interested. And then again they lost control and needed to hard reboot a second time. I genuinely loved Vanguard so much, but it is a perfect example of what happens when a game has a loosely controlled resource system and doesn't do anything to keep it in check. Not only that, but the trigger system in this game just increased the variance of the game as well, so while there might not be any lands or energies that could break up your hand, these 16 trigger cards, which were mandatory to include in the deck, created a problem of their own. They would make your draws more inconsistent if you were looking for actual units, and if you draw them while not checking triggers, you are essentially losing out on powerful effects by missing their timing. Notably, Vanguard did actually mitigate this aspect a bit, as trigger cards tended to have the highest shield power, so if you did draw into them, you would at least be able to protect yourself, which was something. But with that, we can move on to 2014 and the first big digital card game, Hearthstone. This game aimed to simplify Magic the Gathering in a lot of ways. Firstly, the goal of the game was the same, dropping your opponent to 0 life, though you would start at 30 rather than 20. You were also limited to 7 spaces on the board, which meant that you'd never be looking at infinite tokens on the field. However, the biggest change is to the mana system. Digital games tend to take a different path than what we've seen to TCGs up to this point by automating mana. Rather than having lands in your deck and needing to play them, Hearthstone would give each player a mana gem at the start of each of their turns until they had 10. This guaranteed your resources, made sure that you wouldn't draw mandatory cards in the deck that were bricks, and controlled the pace of the game unless you were playing Druid. Using the digital client to manage this resource for players made this feel great, and stopped any problem like being mana screwed or mana flooded. And for the most part, that's what Hearthstone wanted to do, simplify Magic. So there isn't really too many other resources that we gotta talk about here. However, what is important to note is that as players didn't have to worry about the variance involved in mana, they could actually plan. strategize, and predictably have an understanding of what a game would look like before entering into it. This, on paper, would allow Hearthstone to be a game that was purely skill-based. Knowing the matchups and making good decisions would allow you to win most games. And sure, it is still a card game, so the general drawing variance is there, and some matchups might be better or worse, but that's kind of at the core of what it means to play a card game, so I can't really hold it against them. The bigger problem is that early Hearthstone design largely focused on RNG and random effects to take advantage of the digital aspect of the game. For example, one of the most iconic cards from the early game was Ragnaros, who would deal 8 damage randomly to one of your opponent's units or their face every turn. And whether it hit a good unit, a bad unit, or dealt direct damage would be game-defining in a lot of the cases that he was put on the field. And so what could have been extremely competitive ended up being extremely casual and silly, which, to be fair, is kind of what they were going for. Since then, though, this aspect has been walked back quite a bit, and rather than pure randomness, we have controlled randomness. More often than not, a card that generates a random card will, say, generate a random mage card, or generate a fire spell. And this keeps that fun anything can happen aspect in the game, while also adding some predictability on both the player and their opponent's side of the game, so that they can have some idea of what to expect going forward. Which is something that our next game learned from, as it used the same style of randomness, though again in limited supplies. Legends of Runeterra is Riot's digital TCG, which dropped in 2020, and it basically said, okay, what worked in Hearthstone and what didn't, and then went from there. This resource system is almost exactly the same as Hearthstone, having automatically generated mana that builds up each turn until you have 10. But Runeterra added one of the coolest resource systems alongside this, being spell mana. Any mana that was unspent at the end of your turn, up to 3, could be preserved for following turns and used to cast spells. This meant that if you missed your early game units, you would often have mana available to cast very powerful spells much sooner than you would otherwise, often turning a bad situation into an advantage. Hearthstone and Runeterra both push skill away from resource management and towards sequencing, tempo, and matchup knowledge, which in the best situations makes their games feel more consistent, accessible, and easier to balance. But with that though, we can finally talk about Riftbound. I am very concise and can organize my thoughts efficiently. Do not look at the video time. Anyways, Riftbound wanted to take and combine the best parts of the resource systems of these prior games, taking the consistency of digital games into a physical card game, while also making use of a system that hopefully won't allow things to spiral out of control. For starters, Riftbound uses a rune system that mirrors Magic's lands. You need to tap a rune to generate an energy, which can then be used to pay for your cards. However, these runes would be kept in a separate deck, and each turn you would automatically generate 2 of them using the automated system that we saw in games like Hearthstone to solve the mana inconsistency issues of games like Magic or Pokemon in a physical game. The twist to this system is power costs. Many powerful cards require you to recycle your runes by placing them to the bottom of your rune deck in order to be played. So, to get access to stronger and flashier cards, you need to actively choose to put your runes back a little bit. Interestingly, this is kind of like the reverse of LOR, as you are choosing to shrink your rune pool rather than conserving mana for future turns. This really reminds me of the high-risk, high-reward damage system that we saw in Vanguard as well. You can choose to put yourself in a worse or more vulnerable position in exchange for accessing stronger cards. If you overdo it by spending too much power, suddenly you can't play your big cards on following turns, while your opponent might still have access to everything. But if you don't spend power, you're oftentimes going to fall behind as you're using weaker game pieces on average. I love this kind of management system. You're not fighting randomness in Riftbound, you're fighting your own decisions, and that's really rewarding when it works out. One interesting choice with this game, though, is the removal of the board size limits again. Since Magic, almost every TCG has put a limit to how many units they can have on the field, but Riftbound allows you to play any amount. That might seem like a weird choice, as it can definitely be overwhelming, especially to new players, but the game self-mitigates this to some degree through the location system. There are typically 3 locations that you have access to while playing Riftbound: your base, which you can always play units and gear to, and then 2 battlefields, which are used for scoring points and performing fights. Importantly, units can't typically move from one battlefield to the other, and your base needs to act as a midpoint between them. So while you can have infinite units in the game, you need to manage these units in a way which allows you to maintain control, or at least pressure, over both of these battlefields. So yes, you have the potential for bigger boards, but they are typically split between 3 locations, and that helps quite a bit. But with the resource systems now in mind, you can kind of see how TCGs have evolved over time, and how Riftbound has learned from these games that came before it. And using these tools, Riftbound is able to control the speed of their game, control what players are able to do and how often they can do it, and control how much variance and risk players need to actually play with. But these resources only matter if they are actually allowing the player to move towards something, which brings us to the second topic, the goal of the game and how you play it. Luckily, I've already discussed the win conditions of these games pretty loosely, but in general, there are 2 win conditions that most TCGs play with. Yes, there are others and alt-win cons in these games specifically, but typically we're either working with a life system or a point system of some kind. In the life category, we have things like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Hearthstone, and Runeterra, where the goal is to bring your opponent to 0 health. And on the point side, we have games like Pokemon and Riftbound, where players are racing to gather points or accomplish some kind of task before the opponent does. And Vanguard is kind of a hybrid of both, where you're dealing damage to lower your opponent's life, but they're the one accumulating the resource. Neither system is inherently better or worse than the other, obviously, but they definitely do have their own issues and benefits to them. For example, clarity. I think in general, the idea of hitting your opponent and lowering their life until they have none left is extremely intuitive and pretty easy for most people to understand at a glance. Whereas scoring points comes with a question built into it. How do we actually score points in this game? So let's compare Magic and Riftbound really quick. In Magic, when one of your creatures hits the other player, they lose life equal to that creature's power. In Riftbound, players can earn points by conquering a battlefield, then if that player can hold the battlefield through their opponent's turn and maintain control into their next turn, they get a point as well. However, players cannot score the final point by conquering unless they have also scored on all other battlefields that turn. So, just objectively, that is a little bit harder to parse, especially because of that condition on the final point. The amount of players who get really confused by that final point thing is a real problem, though once you understand it, it never really becomes an issue ever again. On the other hand, points are often a more clear representation of who is actually ahead on the board. For example, if one player has 1 point and the other has 7, it is pretty straightforward what the situation is. Whereas life is kind of nebulous, to the point that many people in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Will make the comment that the only life point that actually matters is the last one. One of my favorite examples of this in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the Dinomorphia archetype, which all have abilities that will cut your own life points in half to use their effects. So you can end up in these really strange game states where despite being in a winning position, the life points can be like 63 to 8,000. And even though you only have 63 life, your opponent is unable to do anything to win back the board, and so you win in the end anyways. Having 8,000 life doesn't matter. Or in Magic, sometimes life completely doesn't matter. Like when cards such as Platinum Angel are on the field and stop a player from losing the game, even if they have negative a billion life. And sure, both of those situations are kind of extreme examples, but that's just something that's not really going to happen in Pokemon or Riftbound. It's not like in Riftbound you can have 50 points and the game isn't decided because there's some condition preventing it. Once you hit 8, you hit 8. The next big difference between life and point systems though is how they handle momentum, and more specifically how snowballing and comebacks work. In other words, once a player starts to pull ahead, how easy is it for them to convert that advantage into a win, and how possible is it for the other player to fight their way back in? In life-based games, advantage doesn't always translate cleanly into progress towards winning. You can be ahead on board, ahead on cards, ahead on tempo, and still lose in a single turn if your opponent finds the right combo or removal or burst of damage. This is why life-based systems tend to produce big comeback moments. You can be losing for 10 turns and still win on turn 11. That makes games feel dramatic, intense, and exciting, but it also means that sometimes wins feel stolen and losses feel unfair. How many times have you been at an event with a friend and heard someone say something like, "I was winning the whole game, but then they drew the out and won on the spot"? From a design perspective, that's both a feature and a bug. And from a gameplay perspective, that is the highest high and lowest low, depending on which side of the table you're on. It keeps players emotionally invested because there's always an opportunity for things to change. You're never fully out of the game until you're actually dead. There is always hope, always a line, always a chance to draw that one card that saves you and windmill slam the top card of your deck onto the table. But the blowouts can make a whole game of great or even perfect plays feel invalidated. If early and mid-game advantages don't reliably convert into wins, players can feel like the decisions they make didn't matter. And point systems are on the opposite end of that spectrum. In point-based games, advantage almost always turns into progress. If you're winning fights, controlling space, or completing objectives, you are actively moving closer to victory. That makes point systems feel more fair and consistent in most cases, and when you win, it usually feels earned. Meanwhile, if you lose, you can usually see it coming. A nice part of Pokemon and Riftbound specifically is that there's a kind of a built-in limit to the pace of the game. In Riftbound, you can usually only score 2 points per turn, and in Pokemon, there is typically only 1 or 2 prize cards being earned at a time. So your opponent inherently has time to react, and if they manage to take back the board, then you get your opportunity to do the same. Blowouts are way less common and much more contained. The downside of that is that point-based systems are much more vulnerable to snowballing. Once a player gets ahead, they can often stay ahead. If the opponent can't react to the board, then suddenly that forced slower pace becomes a huge hurdle for them to move over. Again, let's look at Riftbound, and like I said, if one player captures both battlefields, they get 2 points, and they can pass to their opponent. Then ideally, the opponent can take those battlefields back, or at least one of them, and get points of their own. But if they can't do that, then the first player will get another 2 points, and rather than spending their turn reacting to what their opponent did, they can fortify their own position, making it harder for the opponent to get back in the game moving forward. So while point systems can be great when both players are actively interacting with the game, if a player is behind and draws a bad card at the wrong time, that benefit can become a massive detriment. This is why point-based systems almost always need explicit catch-up mechanics. As I mentioned, my favorite example of this is Vanguard's damage system, which gave players access to using abilities and had the potential to activate triggers. This admittedly is a space that Riftbound can struggle with, though most decks do have access to powerful comeback cards. For example, Misfortune's Bullet Time. And in the Mind Domain, you have things like Unchecked Power or Thousand Tail Watcher. Though notably, it would be okay if specific colors didn't have comeback mechanics built into them, and you would need to supplement those weaknesses by combining them with colors that did. Intentionality is important here. On top of that, the restriction on scoring the final point also helps with this, by forcing the last point to be scored by holding or by scoring all battlefields before conquering. It almost always ensures that the defending player will have a little bit more time to react. Again, neither system is inherently better. Life prioritizes dramatic moments and comeback potential, but it can also come at the cost of feeling unfair sometimes. Meanwhile, points add a ton of consistency but can feel slower, and in the worst case, can feel a bit soul-crushing to deal with. And the last big thing I want to talk about before we move on is skill expression in these systems. Because all of these games test players in different ways. Some test planning, some test execution or probability management, or your ability to read your opponent, or your ability to stay awake long enough to make it through their combo in Yugioh. And the win condition a game uses has a huge impact on which of those skills actually matter. In life-based games, skill is often expressed through timing, threat assessment, or combo knowledge. And you're constantly asking questions like, can I afford to take this hit? Am I safe this turn? How can I set up lethal for next turn? You are trying to develop a board that can overwhelm your opponent or outvalue them and survive whatever they throw at you. This is why life-based systems tend to reward players who are good at sequencing, bluffing, and hiding information. A player who understands skills like when to hold interaction and when to go all in can steal games even in the worst situations. But point-based games shift that focus. In point systems, skill is much more about positioning, consistency, and long-term planning. You're usually less concerned with setting up a single explosive turn and more concerned with maintaining control, denying progress, and slowly building towards victory. Instead of asking, can I kill them next turn, you're asking, how do I hold this battlefield? How do I contest that battlefield? How do I prevent them from scoring this round or stop them from getting into a position to take over the board? The skill expression here is more about sustained advantage, and it rewards players who can read the board state, anticipate future turns, and make small, correct decisions over and over again. And with that, we can finally move on to the cards, and how each of these games allows players to express themselves in deck building and playstyle. This is arguably the most important factor. We've all played decks that just don't fit with how we like to play the game, and we know how terribly that incongruence can be. And we've all played decks that perfectly fit our style, and know how much of a difference that can make for connecting a player to the game. And so, once again, we're going to go back to Magic. Magic divides all of their cards into 6 categories or colors. These are white, blue, black, red, green, and colorless. Each of these has their own themes and playstyles. For example, blue often revolves around card draw and counter spells, while green ramps mana and plays big bunguses. And while most people are able to resonate with one specific color, what is super cool about Magic is that you can fine-tune that by combining colors in your deck. Of course, this comes at the risk of making your deck less consistent by requiring other colored lands to be in it, but it also lets you cover the weaknesses of specific colors or close in on your exact playstyle more directly. We see something very similar in Pokemon with their types, like fire, water, or grass, which each have their own specific themes and ideas behind them. For example, fire will burn up energy to use its stronger attacks. Vanguard had 24 specific clans in its first run, with things like Nova Grapplers who could get extra attacks each turn, Shadow Paladins that would sacrifice their own units for big benefits, or Granblue that could bring units back from the grave. Hearthstone has its 11 classes, and almost every TCG has categories like this that players can choose between to build their decks, with the exception of Yu-Gi-Oh, because they don't like limiting their players at all. Yu-Gi-Oh players can put any card in their deck with no restriction outside of the ban list, which Magic or Pokemon can technically do as well, but with no mana or energy, Yu-Gi-Oh does it the most consistently, and because Yu-Gi-Oh is an eternal format with no rotation, truly every card is available. Now that is with a massive grain of salt for a few reasons. Firstly, while deck building was open-ended in Yu-Gi-Oh, it also tended to reward players who build around themes by having built-in synergies. Each monster card has one of 6 attributes: fire, water, earth, wind, light, and dark. Erase that comment about Divine right now, so help me God, I will find you. And these monsters also had many creature types like dragons, spellcasters, warriors, or zombies. And oftentimes, cards would give you benefits for playing within that type or attribute. For example, one of the most iconic cards of all time, Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning, can only be summoned by banishing a light and a dark monster from your graveyard, and so you would kind of build your deck around this theme of light and darks. Of course, while those synergies existed, sometimes it was just better to play a pile of good stuff. If you compare some of the decks in GOAT format, you'll find that upwards of 30 cards are kind of just copied and pasted between each deck, regardless of what the theme is. And that's just because they all have access to all the good cards. And this allows for some completely absurd combos. Like I said, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you can basically do cold fusion if you want to. For example, there's an old Team Samurai video where Jesse Cotton starts with a single card in his hand and then performs a 35-minute combo that allows him to summon Zushin the Sleeping Giant, Dark Sage, Gate Guardian, Thanon the Great Sphinx, and Venominaga, 5 of the most convoluted and difficult cards to make in all of Yu-Gi-Oh, all in one turn. Or MBT has his Dual Tainting series where players have to make the most absurd possible combos to make him laugh, which has showcased everything from players recreating the 2024 election, forcing him to perform 9/11, and generating thousands of just the stupidest puns you've ever seen, all through Yu-Gi-Oh cards. When I say you can do cold fusion with this game, I am barely exaggerating. And that is largely a result of not having restrictions on the cards you can put in your deck. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Eventually changed with the introduction and emphasis of archetypes, cards that were specifically designed to work within their own group. Gravekeepers and Harpies were early examples of this, but with Heroes, Lightsworns, and Gladiator Beasts came a bit of a turning point. And now, rather than having the 5 colors that Magic works with, for example, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is essentially a collection of 400 or so archetypes that players are able to choose from, of which maybe like 20 or 30 are playable at any given time in the meta. And while that is a bit of a bummer because most get power crept with time, it does allow for hyper-specific playstyles to emerge. My personal favorite decks include Danger Dark World, which has you discard cards from your hand, sometimes at random, and getting powerful effects based on the results. And then there's the Nemlaria deck, which wants you to banish your extra deck cards rather than actually playing them to enable big bursty removal turns. Are these decks good? No. but they are extremely specific to what I like to do in a game, and they're very fun. As a player, I love decks that play on different axes than the typical game does, and because of the sheer number of archetypes and themes that Yu-Gi-Oh has, you get to do that. But this change for Yu-Gi-Oh is basically the nail in the coffin that completely solidifies the idea that open-ended deck building is kind of a bad idea, at least in a game with an ever-expanding card pool with no real resource restrictions on it. It just becomes too difficult to balance, too loose to mean anything, and decks end up playing a pile of the best cards rather than having a real identity, which is why Yu-Gi-Oh moved away from that. Interestingly, Magic's most popular format also kind of does this. At least, like, if you squint your eyes really hard, it does this. Commander has players select a legendary creature and then use them as, well, their commander. The color identity of that creature then dictates which colors you're allowed to include in your decks. This essentially means that there are as many deck building styles and themes as there are legendaries in Magic, which right now is nearly 3,000 of them, I think. And sure, in reality, there's a ton of overlap, and a bunch of them are just not good or worth playing, but between typal archetypes, playstyle themes, and the commanders and their colors, we are again working towards very specific and personalized experiences where anyone can find something to connect with. Notably, Legends of Runeterra also took this path. To build a deck in this game, players could combine cards from any two regions, and then choose champions from those regions to build the deck around. In a way, it's kind of like a pseudo-commander system. Riot then refined this one step further as we get into Riftbound. Rather than regions, Riftbound has 6 domains that their cards are split into. The aggressive Fury domain, the spell-heavy Mind domain, the combat-focused Body domain, the Calm domain, which makes use of powerful defensive spells, the Order domain, which is all about creating life through tokens and removing it through kill effects, and the Chaos domain, which is all about disrupting the board and hand states. Off the bat, that is basically just the color system in Magic, obviously. On top of that, players must choose a legend card to build their deck around. Each legend belongs to a pair of domains, and like commanders, they will dictate the colors that you're allowed to play in the deck. So for example, Ahri is in the Mind and Calm domains, so you can only play blue and green cards if she is your legend. On top of the legends dictating your card pool, each also offers a unique ability. For example, Ahri lowers the might of units that attack you by 1. Viktor can be exhausted to make a token every turn, and Misfortune can give one of your units ganking so they can move from one battlefield to the other. As I said, this kind of mirrors Commander pretty heavily, but what's interesting is the way that this is implemented is specifically similar to the Eminence ability in Magic. This basically allowed commanders to affect the board before even being played, and notably is often cited as one of the biggest mistakes ever made for the Commander format. So naturally, all of Riftbound is based on that idea. That said, the legend system in general works pretty well as a whole because the entire game is actually based around it, which helps, go figure. But with such a limited selection right now, deck building can kind of feel funneled. If you want to play Fury and Body, for example, you have to play Volibear because that's all we have in the Origin set. And if your legend is Volibear, you kind of have to build your deck around mighty units. And the same is true for every color combination, as we only have one legend for most combos. Luckily, Spiritforge seems to be making the active decision to make the new legends for each domain pair feel distinct, if not completely opposite to the original option. For example, Lucian is our new Fury and Body legend, and he focuses on a low-to-the-ground aggro deck that makes use of equipment. This is super interesting, as while the decks have access to the exact same card pool in those colors, the legends that we select can alter how the game plays out. Again, very similar to Commander. However, admittedly, Riftbound has an extremely limited card pool and an even more limited legend pool right now. And because of that, it is hard to evaluate Riftbound's cards as the options just aren't there yet. But the intention and thought clearly are. The systems that a game uses, things like color, domain, archetypes, and legends, they don't just limit you, they give you meaningful choices. They give your deck an identity, and they give you a way to express what kind of player you are. And whether that expression comes from combining colors, committing to an archetype, or building around a legend, that sense of ownership and connection is what turns a card game from something that you play into something that you identify with. And that's the through line across all of this, from resources to win conditions to card design. Making a good TCG is about building systems that let players make meaningful decisions, that let them feel in control of their outcomes, and that lets them express themselves in the way that they play. And with decades of other TCGs evolving, experimenting, and learning from mistakes that Riftbound can incorporate, it has, somewhat ironically, this amazing chance to become something that actually feels like Magic. That is Magic the noun, not the gathering. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch this. If you enjoyed, remember to leave a like and subscribe. If you want more video essay style content from me, let me know in the comments. You can also support me over on Patreon or join the Discord if you're looking to talk more Riftbound. With all that being said though, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.